Hi, and welcome back to Map the Maze. Today I thought I would share with you the view, my favorite building across the street, but also talk to you about healing. How can you do it faster? Often when I speak with clients who are divorcing and separating, one of the challenges is they are experiencing significant amounts of pain and loss and grief and sadness and anger and rage, and have been for some time, that it can be really difficult to imagine that there is a world outside or after. And that I think for a lot of the clients that I work with, the overwhelm is so significant that it is almost impossible to consider a time when you won't be in the middle of this chaos, that you won't be struggling and that you won't be in pain. And I think there are definitely things that you can do to prolong pain, and there are things you can do to make it shorter. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that I have seen clients do, or that I have done myself, to help take me out of pain, grief, loss, and make healing faster and maybe even better in some ways. I wanted to share a story about myself, and I have spoken about this with Dr. Monica Borschel on our pod, The Behavior Detectives. But one of the things that I think happened to me back in 2021, I had two large village dogs. In Hong Kong, that means a dog who comes from the village, that mom, dad, grandparents are whoever is in the village, that there's no breeding, so to speak. And what tends to happen in Hong Kong is that one particular type of village dog ends up being sort of like a small Labrador looking type of dog. I had two, brother and sister, Fred and Ginger, who I had had since 2007. They were almost 15 in 2021. And despite the fact that Fred had significant health issues and autoimmune diseases and required upwards of 14 tablets a day just to stay healthy, Ginger was the dog who I lost first. And when Ginger passed, I was devastated, because I really had thought that Fred would go and Ginger and I would have time to do things together that we hadn't done because they were too much for Fred. She was always much healthier and much more active than him and more adventurous. It was difficult to deal with that. And then 6 months later, almost to the day, I lost Fred. And that was different in the sense that he was so frail that last week that I had already spoken to the vet about coming in after Christmas. Needless to say, after 14 plus years of looking after two dogs who became very central to my life and my routines and my schedule, I was devastated. And I apologize now to all of the taxi drivers who I burst into tears in their taxis, because it seemed like the only private space that I had was in the taxi. So, needless to say, really devastated. And I appreciate there are going to be people who are listening to this who just say, it's a pet, what's the big deal? Animals die. We all know they have shorter lifespans than humans. Get over it. I appreciate that. And maybe if that's who you are, possibly don't watch this video. It's maybe not for you. Anyway, I was really devastated, but also felt the massive void that had happened in life, because if you are used to having animals, particularly large animals, in your home, coming home to a place where there are no animals is like, I mean, it sounds dramatic, but it is like coming back to a dead place, because there is no life happening there that isn't human. And there is something about the type of energy that animals bring to a space that, at least for me, I find comforting and is something that I really enjoy and love. So without having Fred and Ginger there, it was it was like the house was a mausoleum, even though there was no one there. I was struggling with the thought of how do I continue living with this empty house without, as it felt to me, without life. And some friends had decided to foster a dog for the first time and had asked if I could come over and just help ease them into having a dog in their home. And this was a dog who had had some medical issues and was really there for medical recuperation. Needless to say, they foster failed, which was very good news for them and I think and for the dog. She's ended up with a lovely family and they've ended up with a very sweet pooch. But what was really interesting for me is later when I was reflecting, because my friend had said, look, I know that you've just lost Fred and this might be difficult. And actually going to help them and spending time talking to them about the dog that they were fostering and what they were experiencing and what might be going on for the dog was so healing for me. And I think really accelerated my healing, because within a month of them fostering this dog and starting to ask me for some help, I had decided I was ready to have another dog in the home. And it was really interesting to me because at the time I thought it's going to take a year to be able to contemplate having another dog in the house. But I think helping somebody else and helping a dog was actually probably the most healing thing I could have done, because it made me reconnect with what I love about having animals and also reconnect with having a rescue dog and what that means for the dog, what it can mean for somebody else's life. Long story short, I ended up getting another dog who has featured in some of these videos, although she is very cute, but she is also very cat-like. She is not really a dog, to be perfectly honest. I did not know that when I adopted her, but regardless, she is loved. The reason I'm sharing this rambling story is that there is something about helping others, about coming out of your own mental space that I think is incredibly healing and I think speeds up our own healing. One of the things that I often see people do when they are separating and divorcing is, in addition to the massive disruption that divorce is and the massive potential change in every element of their life, whether it is where they live, how they live, whether they work, how they work, all of those aspects can be completely turned topsy-turvy. But one thing I have seen several people do time and again is decide that this is an opportunity, that this is a time when instead of maybe putting to one side hopes or ideas that they had about what they might do with their lives, or prioritizing the relationship or the other person over their plans, is people decide this is the opportunity to do what I have always wanted to do. For example, I remember one woman who had worked as a teaching assistant, really loved it, but didn't want to do that full time, didn't want to commit to teaching qualifications because she was worried that it would have detracted from the relationship, it would have taken time away from the family. That family also had a child who was special needs, and she had really become very focused on how can I provide for my child who is struggling in Hong Kong and for whom there are not many resources. One of the things that she decided as a result of getting divorced was that there was a decision that the family would relocate from Hong Kong because Hong Kong was too expensive. But what it meant is she then had an opportunity to go back to her home country. She found a program that she would be able to take to qualify as a special needs teacher. And she was transformed. I remember the difference in seeing them the week before when they had been at mediation and the week after when she had found this program, had already spoken to them, had already enrolled. I didn't know if she'd been accepted yet at that stage, but she had enrolled because she had literally been transformed by the idea that she would be able to do something constructive, do something for herself, do something that she found meaningful. And it it changed the quality, the nature of how she was in the mediation, because instead of now looking at the future with fear and trepidation and uncertainty, there's still uncertainty, but what she had was a goal. She had a vision. She had somewhere that she wanted to be. She wanted to be in that town so that she could do the training, so that she could then qualify, so that she could then do special needs teaching. And for her, it was almost as if life had been unlocked. Because if she had stayed in the marriage, and this is her words, not mine, she didn't think this would ever have happened. She would never have had the opportunity to go and do this. So there was something transformative for her about realizing that, yes, there was sadness and loss and endings, but there were also beginnings. And that not only was it personally rewarding for her, but this was a way of providing for the family going forward. That was a kind of an inspirational story about somebody who turned their divorce into a real opportunity. Regardless, though, I have seen people who have used the divorce as a reset. People who were maybe very comfortable in the marriage, for whom now the uncertainty of separating and divorcing makes it seem like everything is in limbo, everything can change, who have decided to go back to work. I remember, again, talking to another client who had not worked for a long time, had given up a really important career for them that they really loved, that they were great at, but decided, I'm going to be a stay-at-home wife and mother. They had done that for several years. When the divorce happened, they decided to try and go back into the job market. And at the time, I remember hearing initially, well, it will probably just be very small. Maybe I can do some kind of small role in the industry that I used to work in. The next time they came back to mediation and I asked what had happened, how things were going, the update was that this person now had a regional role, because in fact what had happened is they'd approached their former employer, who was ecstatic at the thought of getting them back into the workplace, and so had offered them this incredibly interesting, dynamic role. I'm not saying there are regional roles out there for everybody, but I guess what I am saying is that until you ask, you don't know, and that not only can it be personally rewarding and stimulating, but I think for this particular client, the other thing that I saw was it massively increased their self-confidence, because instead of feeling that they were being left behind, that the divorce was somehow meaning that they were being discarded, they were being needed and wanted, and their expertise and their experience was being celebrated by their employer and recognized. I think it was incredibly validating. And what I would say is that, yes, it's an end, but as we know, and I know it's fatuous, every end is a beginning. And I appreciate that is not helpful advice if you're going through this. But one thing I would say is that I think doing, engaging, helps healing, makes healing faster. The other thing I would suggest thinking about is if you are trying to heal, and maybe you don't have a personal qualification or a career or some type of work that you've always wanted to do and this is the chance, or maybe you don't have a former employer that you want to go back to, and or a career or an industry that you really loved, and now this is a chance to go back to it. The other option is to do something for someone else, because I think, for me at least, my personal healing story about helping those friends who were fostering a dog, it was actually doing something for the dog. It was doing something for my friends. It was doing something for somebody else. And over the last couple of years, I have been really grateful to have been able to do some work with an NGO, the Zubin Foundation, around forced marriage. It has been just an incredible honor to be able to meet some of these women who are extraordinary. These Hong Kong women who have survived forced marriage, thrived after forced marriage. That's been a real blessing in my life. But also that there is an entire network of NGOs who are working in this or connected spaces, who are so open and welcoming. And I think that has been a real joy for me, because you might think, I would like to do something worthwhile, but maybe there's a reticence, or you feel a bit nervous about reaching out, or you think, actually, what can I do? There's nothing, I have no special skills, I don't have anything I can do. And what I would say is, I have felt that for ages, and I was proved wrong. And I was also proved wrong because there is space. What I would say is, for me, that has been incredibly rewarding. And that I think with all of the challenges that we have at the moment and all the difficulties that people have been through, not just in their personal lives, but just in living, it's not exactly been an endless fun party for the world the last 10 plus years. This has been incredibly helpful to me, and I think very healing, because not only can you feel that you are doing something worthwhile that is helpful and contributes to other people, but also engaging with people who are helpful and who are contributing to other people is incredibly rewarding. It really reminds you that not everyone is just in it for themselves, and not everyone is selfish. Not everybody is only focused on their own good, that there are lots of people who work tirelessly in really difficult areas with very few resources to actually try and help improve the lives of others. And that when you get to meet those others, people whose lives have been impacted by some of these NGOs, you can see how extraordinary people are. That whether it is their grace, their forgiveness, their strength, their resilience, their positive desire to engage with life and education and self-sufficiency and self-respect, it is really inspiring. And I think one of the things that I would suggest is, if you are struggling, if you are trying to find a way to healing from maybe your divorce or separation, or maybe something else that's happened, finding someone else to help is an incredibly powerful way of helping to heal yourself. And I think it works on different levels. I think one level is it takes you out of yourself. I think on another level, it makes you grateful for what you do have. And I think on another level, it is just inspiring. It is inspiring to see people who work in this area full time, and maybe that becomes you. And it is inspiring to see the people who are helped by NGOs, who are helping themselves through NGOs, because they are extraordinary people. And I think back, sometimes it was kind of difficult when I was working on the forced marriage report and interviewing people who had experienced terrible treatment at the hands of their families and community, who had no resources, who had nothing, who were struggling to get an education, but who had so much grace about themselves and who held themselves with such dignity and thirst for learning. It was incredibly inspiring. Did make some days being at work difficult, because obviously sometimes I'm working with people who are struggling with what do not, in comparison, seem to be difficult challenges. Difficult for them, but maybe not as difficult as these people. Anyway, if you are thinking about trying to find a path to healing and you would like to do it maybe a little bit faster, then I would strongly suggest thinking about, is there someone else who I could help? It's got to be within your capacity. You've got to be able to manage to do it. So I'm not suggesting jumping into something incredibly difficult, but what I would suggest is to have a look around. Start looking at your network. Is there somebody who I know who could maybe introduce me to somebody, or who I could help, or who I could offer to help, or whom I could get in touch with? Helping someone else is the fastest way to help yourself. Okay. That ends it for today. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week. Bye. Take care.